13% of world tropical timber comes from Gabon. Cut trees, make logs out of it. You can have sawmills, you can have plywood, veneer, and you can have plywood, varying degrees of value added. And what happened to Gabon is that the market for the value added products fell as China became the dominant source of consumption. Over a period of 15 or 20 years, the market for Gabonese timber shifted from Europe to China. Now, two things happened. One I'm going to talk about, the other I'm not. The first one is that the Chinese are not interested in processing, or certainly weren't then. Maybe they will in the future. What I want to show you about is the importance given to by buyers in the EU and China to, let me do the next one, it's more helpful, to environmental regulations and private standards. And as you can see, when the market shifts to a developing country, the things that sustainability issues, which we have come to see as being essential to the sustainability of the ecosystem, get thrown out the window. It's not that Chinese or Indian consumers are cruel. It's not that they don't care about things. They do not have the incomes to care. If a Western firm were to adopt those standards and then find themselves subject to vilification in their major markets in the north, Walmart employs child labor. Tesco salads have high pesticide residues. IKEA furniture is destroying tropical forests, and what will happen to the orangutans? Poor people can't afford products which embody these standards. The Western firms have a lack of capacity to tackle those markets because of their brand vulnerability. But from the environmental point of view, the economic appropriateness of these technologies, which I've been trying to talk about, is not necessarily environmentally or even socially appropriate. May embody poor labor standards, dangerous working conditions, and whatever. So I'm just trying to now bring a level of complexity into the story. Okay, Harry, I'm going to wind up with some examples, and then, yeah, what do you think, is that okay? Well, I'm going to give you two examples first, and then perhaps people in this room might have some. I worked for some time in Africa with, forgive me, a group of African economists looking at the impact of China in Africa. And the Cameroonians produced a wonderfully interesting paper, which it's not the same one about the prostitutes, incidentally. They also have a paper on perceptions of Cameroonian consumers towards Chinese goods, which is uniformly critical and bad. It's rubbish, cheap Chinese goods. In fact, and they've got evidence, Chinese batteries only last half as long as Japanese batteries, Japanese and European batteries. The other bit of evidence they have is Chinese motorcycles, which now are dominant in Cameroon, break down often. They have a shorter life, they spend a lot more time being repaired. The batteries only last half as long. They cost 1/3 of the amount. The Chinese motorcycles may spend a lot of time in workshops. They cost 1/3 or less of the Japanese motorcycles. And interestingly, just to build this point a bit, a whole cadre of school leavers who were formerly cut out of productive employment have become logistics operators with these motorcycles. They looked at who was buying the Chinese motorcycles, and there were school leavers who became messengers, they became motorcycle taxis, they became deliverers, and whatever. Here's an example of how low-quality products, which all of my African elite friends say, we don't want to buy Chinese products, they're just rubbish. Yeah, they are rubbish. They don't last as long, but people can afford them. Such a graphic image in my mind when I first started speaking of this, of a very smart person in Nairobi. She got up and said, look, I just bought a transistor radio from China and it's rubbish. I had to throw it away after 18 months. She's gone out and bought someone for $70 or $80 or something. I said, how much do you pay for your Chinese radio? $4. Okay, so it's around this You see it all over Africa, and I believe in Latin America as well. Everywhere you go, you see, and it's not a Chinese phenomenon because the Chinese are in any other way. You see Chinese, I mean, Norman, your story is slightly different, isn't it, of the sugar factory in Sierra Leone. Norman was saying when he went to Sierra Leone, nothing was in operation, nothing productive at all. Then I think he went to a sugar plant in the countryside, only thing operating being run by Chinese, right? But that's a slightly different story. But anybody who goes on Africa, you can't but be hit in the face the whole time. I can see Linda nodding her head, by cheap Chinese goods, sold often by Chinese migrants, mostly there illegally, rubbish. All the products are rubbish, but poor people can afford. Okay, and then I know, since I don't want to make the story about only about China and India, that we also have a problem now in the rich countries. We have a problem which is both around the quality and nature of the growth experience, but we have also an increasing problem of marginalization in the rich countries as well. And I think most of us are beginning now to think again about who is it, what sorts of things are being innovated in the rich countries. I mean, I have in mind when Luke gave his talk last year at the Murray Yehuda lecture, I think it was Luke, he spoke about the gales of creative destruction. His parody of the innovation framework, a trajectory in the rich countries, thinking particularly about social innovation. And I think we're beginning to see also now in the rich countries an increasing, as it were, bottom-up innovation, which is beginning to transform the perspectives. And I'm going to end off with rather weak, I'm afraid, policy implications. Again, with a developing country perspective, but I gather that's not really a SPRU agenda much anymore, a centrum agenda. So you might want to think about the rich country parts of it. Here's my central argument. Diffusion has a momentum of its own. It's happening. It's manifest in front of your eyes. Go to any developing countries, you'll see the products. And you'll see, I've got 3 students now going into the field. One looking at agricultural mechanization in Tanzania, where the Indian tractors, Chinese tractors, Iranian tractors, and American tractors. The other one's going to look at the clothing and textiles value chain in Uganda, asking the question, where does this technology come from? Are there new technologies out there which are giving new opportunities to poor people? The third one's going to look at metalworking and woodworking tools in Kenya, looking at the informal and the formal sector, beginning to ask the question, are we seeing as capital goods, not as consumer goods, are we seeing as capital goods more and more evidence of innovation which is occurring below the radar and which is more appropriate? It's a research hypothesis. Let's see what they come up with. I'm convinced it's a real phenomenon. Okay. It's got momentum, but we need to address market failures. And one of the key market failures, I mean, is a factor price problem. Some people say if only you reduce the prices of wages in developing countries, my own country, South Africa, that would solve the problem. That has an element, but I think these knowledge imperfections are very important. How do poor producers in poor countries find out about and get access to these below-the-radar innovations which are being generated by SMEs in China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico? It happens incidentally, and there's a very big phenomenon in Africa of people getting on a plane, going to China, buying suitcases in China, and coming back to Africa full of bags, telephones, whatever, and increasingly machinery. I got into this some years ago. I was in South Africa, staying in a bed and breakfast on the coast, beautiful. A woman was running it, said to her husband, "You look tired." He said, "Yes, I've just come, I travel a lot." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Oh, I sell corrugated packaging machinery in Africa." I said, "Yeah, I've done a lot of work on the food processing industry. They're Swiss and German, aren't they?" It used to be Swiss and German. I can now get 3 Chinese machines for the price of a Swiss machine. And they can be fixed in Africa, which the Swiss machine can't. So there are these knowledge imperfections of, is this flow of information, the knowledge asymmetry, which Arrow and others spoke about, is this flow of information from the innovators to the users optimized? I think many of the standards which govern technological innovation, the regulatory framework, I think from the perspective of developing countries, needs a sweep. particularly again, I have a colleague at the Open University who's worked on biotechnology standards, which offer just a replication of standards from the rich countries. And I know that these standards are important, and I know the environment's important, and I know we shouldn't harm people when we test medicines. I know all those things are important, but we live in a world of trade-offs. And often from the perspective of poor people is that the trade-offs which are limited by standards developed in rich countries may be inappropriate for poor producers and poor consumers. We have to think about reorienting systems of innovation. Norman, again, has done a lot of work in Africa on how the innovation system is geared to high science, to white collar, to research and development. Whereas often, many of the problems of poor producers in the rural areas and of poor consumers can better be met, and our SPRU work in the IDS group over there is very rich in this, through different bases of knowledge. And I think that has something to say, and I haven't got developed thoughts about it, around the national system of innovation and sectoral and regional systems. Strengthening the role of non-market actors. PPPs are very important in public goods. I mean, there are lots of criticisms of Gates, as you know, that it's too focused on particular products rather than on systems of delivery and whatever. But nevertheless, these non-market actors are important. And very finally, and here I want to raise a paradoxical point, is the redistribution of income. If everything I've said is correct, if it's correct that Rattan does not adequately recognize the structure of demand as a significant inducement to innovation, if it's correct that poor people may want to have a Porsche, but may have to settle for a Tato Nano, then it stands to reason that if income were redistributed, the momentum will be even greater. Well, perhaps it stands to reason, because my final point is in the 1970s,